Hello and welcome to what will be the fifth episode of The Professor Will See You Now, a masterclass followed by a candid conversation with the YIF faculty about their course, their journey, and the ideas that drive them. Just to establish a little bit of ground rules first, we'll have the masterclass for the first 15 minutes, followed by an informal conversation with the professor, and in the end, we address any questions that the audience might have. I'm your host for today. My name is Aanchal, and I'm from the YF batch of 2019. It is my honor to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Dr. Mehta is the former Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University. He was previously the president of the Center of the Policy Research, one of India's leading think tanks. He has been a professor at Harvard University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New York University School of Law, and currently teaches at Ashoka. He writes and is published widely in political theory, constitutional law, society and politics in India, governance and political economy, and international affairs. He's also an editorial consultant to the leading national daily, the Indian Express, where he writes a regular column, along with being on the editorial board of many good journals like the American Political Science Review. He has also been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Amartya Sen Prize. Dr. Mehta holds a bachelor in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford, as well as a doctorate in politics from Princeton University. And these are just some of the many, many feathers in his cap. On that note, the professor will indeed see you now. Welcome, Professor. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Thanks very much, Aanchal. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here and to be able to talk to YIFs. I know I've been remiss in not talking to them enough, so hopefully we can make some amends tonight.
Absolutely, absolutely. Without further ado, and I say this with much collective anticipation, we can dive right into your masterclass about does India have a constitution, rethinking pillars of the democratic experiment. An important one, especially in the current political climate, I would say, and then we can continue the rest of the conversation.
Okay, so good evening. I won't speak for long because I want to hear from you and hopefully we can have a good discussion. I just wanted to say a few words about both a sort of personal journey and a kind of intellectual journey as it relates to scholarly work. So I studied in the United States, taught in the United States for many years, and then we decided to move back to India in the early 2000s. And I think when we moved back, there were three big things we sort of took for granted. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but let's, for convenience sake. The first was the assumption that Indian politics, for all its faults, for all its weaknesses, incredible venality and corruption, would broadly remain centrist in character. You know, the joke used to be there was a thesis in political science, the kind of almost the permanent centrist character of Indian politics, that anybody who ruled India would in a sense have to be centrist. There's an old line by the Hindi poet Hazari Prasad Dwivedi, कि भारत का महानायक वही हो सकता है जो समन्वय कर सके. Only that person can, in a sense, rule India, who can synthesize in some ways, right? So centrist politics broadly understood. You know, there'll be. The second pillar we took for granted was that post 1991, actually the history goes before 1991, but just for convenience sake again, India had embarked on a story of economic reforms. And broadly speaking, that trajectory would be in not just a reformist direction, but would yield substantial results in terms of both growth and using that growth, some distribution or investment in the capacities of the Indian people, right? So if you're getting 8% growth a year, that translates into tax revenues, which allows you to do lots of things you should be doing as a state. And the third assumption we took for granted was that this very anomalous thing called the Indian Constitution, the longest constitution in the world, will continue to provide a basic framework within which Indians adjudicate their identities and their conflicts. This constitution is not perfect by any means, has to be amended, has been amended several times. Like any constitution, it contains the spirit of its times, which sometimes need to be transcended. And like any constitution, it contains some internal tensions. There are competing values within the constitution. So often people with opposed values can appeal to the same text or appeal to the same constitution. But the assumption was broadly that this constitution, uh, whose pulsating heart and unredeemed promise is liberty, equality, and fraternity, will provide the basis for a continuing social contract. And the beauty of the Constitution is that it doesn't require us to agree with each other. In fact, constitutions work precisely because we disagree with each one another. How can we engage in a scheme of social cooperation despite our disagreements? It has great liberatory power. Unlike many constitutions, it doesn't burden us with God or history. Even the Chinese constitution, by the way, burdens the Chinese people with history. Not because our framers did not think that God or history were not important. I mean, God knows they know these two things are important. But it was their sense that it is precisely because these are so important. The Constitution should liberate us to imagine them in whichever way we choose to do so as individuals. Okay? So these were like the broad, framing pillars of our life, of our personal lives, of our political lives, and of our intellectual lives. You kind of took this for granted, right? And then the question was, how do you do policy design in the context of a politics that's broadly centrist, right? How do you resolve the ambiguities and the tensions of the Constitution as, it unfolds over time, okay? And a certain degree of optimism about India's economic prospects. Now, I have to say that it's probably the first time that I think all three pillars rest on shaky ground. I think the question of India's economic trajectory, I'll be very honest, is an open one. I'm not an economist. And as we've learned, we never quite understood why India grew at 8% for a decade or so, from the late 90s to 2008. So I'm the last one to say that, we can say with confidence that India is not going to grow again at 7.5 to 8%. But certainly the last, I guess, from 2009 onwards, after the financial crisis, have been relatively rocky years for the Indian economy. Okay? And I do think growth will be revived, but the prospects of what economists call the K-shaped future for India, right? Where the top 20, 30% do exceedingly well, but the prospects for the bottom 30, 40% don't improve as dramatically as we would like them to, remains, open. But as I said, the economy is something we'll work our way through. In politics, it's fair to say that centrism has collapsed in every sense of the term. India is on its way to becoming an ethnic majoritarian democracy. The basic checks and balances that we assume, institutional checks and balances that we always assumed operate in a constitutional democracy with imperfections. I mean, look, I'll be the last one to say that we did not ever abuse the checks and balances within our constitutional framework. But those were retrievable mistakes. You could, in some senses, overcome them without destroying the basic framework. The checks and balances have eroded. Democracy also survives not just because people are necessarily individually committed to democratic values. Often democracy survives because there is a wide distribution of social power, right? No particular group, no particular ideology, no particular political party is in the position to dominate and impose its will on everybody else. In fact, often democracies are sustained by that distribution of power. Each individual constituent doesn't have particularly salutary values, but together they actually produce something that's better than the sum of its parts, right? And Indian democracy was a bit like that. The social distribution of power is becoming more concentrated on almost any dimension you can imagine. Obviously, the concentration in one political party and perhaps justifiably so. This political party, the BJP, is a wonderful election machine. It has got extraordinary political instincts. You have to give it that. But on other dimensions as well, concentration of capital, for example, right, which is always the fundamental sinew of power in any society. If you add all of these characteristics up, right, declining centrism, ethnic majoritarianism, erosion of checks and balances, people are beginning to ask a question: what is left of those three pillars that I described? And to put it most provocatively, how much can the Indian Constitution, as we understand it, survive the demise of both political centrism, right, and the rise of ethnic majoritarianism? A few years ago, one of my Ashoka colleagues, who's now an Ashoka colleague, Madhav Khosla, and I, along with Sujit Chaudhary, edited a big, fat book called the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution, which at that point, if we can claim immodestly, we thought was a pretty good kind of state-of-the-art two-day horizon of the Indian Constitution. When I reread its chapters today, I have to say that I cannot walk into a classroom with a straight face and say that much of that Constitution endures. 5 years ago, I could tell you what Indian constitutional law is. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but insofar as I study Indian Constitution, Indian constitutional laws, I could tell you what the parameters of the debate are, what the interpretive points are, right? My dilemma as a teacher, as somebody who dabbles in the scholarship on the Constitution, is I can no longer say that with a straight face. Under what conditions will you be afforded habeas corpus protections? The short answer seems to be it's a draw of the lottery almost. That's the kindest gloss I'll put on it. The Constitution envisaged a scheme of federalism, right? Division of powers between centers and states. For all practical purposes, the constitutional vision of that federal separation of powers is more or less unrecognizable now, and will become increasingly so as, in a sense, the years go by. The most fundamental value of that Constitution, right, which, as I said, what I find liberating about it is it doesn't burden you with God and history. It is a charter of freedom. But we are increasingly being asked to imagine our identities, privilege our identities, right, based on particular conceptions of history, based on particular conceptions of religious majoritarianism and dominance. And so you have to ask yourself, is this the same Constitution, right, that was, a brilliant anomaly in the pantheon of global constitutionalism? 70 to 80% of constitutions that are created globally, as a scholar of comparative politics will tell you, don't survive the first 10 to 15 years of their promulgation, right? It's really quite an achievement that the Indian Constitution survived as long as it did. And so my question to you is, what is the Constitution we think we are living under? Do we have a Constitution anymore? Will your generation have to write a new Constitution? As I said, when I moved back in early 2000s, I could take for granted these three background assurances: broadly centrist and open politics, a settled constitutional frame, and a relatively optimistic economic future. What would it mean to think about politics if you can't take any of those frames for granted? And I think our generation did a terrible job of preserving that legacy, which we so optimistically used to tout. I'm just wondering what ideas your generation has about doing a better job than we did. Yeah? So I'll just stop here and hand over to Aanchal.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was an extremely insightful and illuminating lens into the collapse of the liberal democratic project and the internal conflicts that often the Indian Constitution is fraught with. I'm sure everyone on this call, including me, has a lot to reflect on and will leave more aware and enlightened than we came. We already have a myriad of questions, and we will get to addressing those, at some point of time. But at this juncture, I thought we could talk a bit about your journey, motivations, and background, including Ashoka.
Okay.
My first question to you is, what exactly drove you to delve into political theory as your focus? And why did you decide to come back to teach in India after having taught at so many esteemed institutions outside? Of course, we're so pleased that you did, but we'd also love to know why.
So I'll give you a very boring answer to the first part of your question. The second might be a little bit more interesting. The boring part is, I have to say I grew up in an academic household, so we are what used to be called academic brats, kids of academics, and despite kind of parents wanting otherwise, in fact, I think often children end up doing what their parents do, not because the parents want them, but despite that. I got interested in political theory. The short answer is my mathematics was not good enough for economics, which is another discipline that really excited me. And there's no point doing economics if you are not cutting edge in mathematics. The other discipline I toyed with was law. But fundamentally, what drove me to political theory was I said, look, is there a bunch of books which, if I could spend my lifetime reading and get paid a little bit to do it, what would I enjoy doing most? And that was it. I mean, I honestly can't make any grand claims about, how political theory will change the world and so on and so forth. I mean, that might or might not be true, often is not the case. But it was just the sheer love of this particular canon of political theory, both Western and Indian. It's almost like, having deep and profound friends to hang out with every day. And the good things about these friends is they never desert you. They're always there at your beck and command. I have to also say inspiring teachers. I mean, I think when I went to Oxford as an undergrad, I thought I'd end up doing political theory. But it was an extraordinary time at Oxford for political theory. I mean, when I now look back and think of the kind of teachers I had, Oxford then had, Ronald Dworkin, Amartya Sen, Derek Parfit, my own tutors, Alan Ryan in particular. It just was inescapable. I mean, how could you resist hanging out with those people? The coming to India story, look, one thing we know is that people aren't often the best judge of their own motives. I mean, I can tell you what I think my motives were. My friends might have a different story on that. But the one thing I will say, I think, which is very much part of a kind of conscious discussion, that when I was teaching at Harvard, life was comfortable. And one level, Harvard was a dream university. I mean, it's, I just think Widener Library is my idea of heaven in some ways. I mean, absolutely everything is accessible. But one thing I began to sense in those days, and this is pre 9/11 America, so the world has changed quite dramatically, that American society had a settled background consensus in some ways, right? I mean, the only big disputes were the 19th shade of social contract theory versus the 20th shade of social contract theory, right? Whereas all the real action was in India. I mean, frankly, the future of even Western political theory, I began to increasingly feel was going to be decided here. It was not going to be decided in the West, right? Partly there's the excitement of a country where every shade of opinion is a live political prospect, right? So as a political theorist, as a political scientist, what does it mean to think about a society where actually the stakes of this thinking are actually much higher? Right? And so part of what drove us back was that excitement. People did think, I mean, when we went to surrender our green card, we were actually asked to consult a psychiatrist and consultant, that we were doing the wrong thing. But I have no regrets about this decision. I think the excitement. I'll also say one other story on this. Sorry, gone on too long. One colleague
No,
in
no, please.
India at the time So, when I was coming to India, looking what institutions I could join, he said in Punjabi, he said, अगर अखबार पढ़ के खून गर्म करने में मजा आता है तो हिंदुस्तान जरूर आ जाना और खून नहीं गर्म करना है तो बाहर रहना. So, the खून गर्म करना was quite exciting.
Thank you so much for those great anecdotes, Professor. Uh, and I think on something that you said, there's a relevant question, and maybe we can take it right now. Somebody's asked that are we seeing an emergence of what we call an East Asian deontic democracies away from the West, given that there are 81 different democratic republics in India, and India has been like the mother of democracy, as we have called it.
So this is a really interesting question, right? I mean, what is the kind of identity of democracy? And of course, democracy comes in different forms. I mean, it comes in different electoral systems. Democracies have to adapt to particular cultural circumstances. And I, for example, just resist the idea that democracy is actually a Western invention. I mean, let's face it. For most of its history, the West has not had democracy in the sense that we introduced. The Indian experiment in democracy was an extraordinary leap of faith. I mean, there was no precedent in Europe that would have advised that a unlettered, unpropertied, poor country like India actually adopt democracy. In fact, everybody predicted it just cannot work, right? Ironically, as we've gone more richer, we are now worried about whether it'll actually work or, in some senses or not. And Indian democracy, for all its faults, and it had serious faults, was a response to our own organic needs, the form and shape it take. Yes, you can say, look, did we copy this bit of our constitution from, Westminster? Did we take directive principles of state policy from the Irish constitution? True, but that's a very superficial sense. In part, we actually took them and made them our own. I mean, B.N. Rao, who was one of the constitutional advisors to Jawaharlal Nehru, there's an anecdote attributed to him. It's a wonderful one, which is, I think after the constitution was promulgated, a Times of India reporter asked him, said, Mr. Rao, this constitution is great, but what's Indian about it? You've taken directive principles of state policy from Ireland. Our electoral system is British. The judicial system is kind of quasi-American. What's Indian about it? And B.M. Rao is supposed to have replied. He says, before we were independents, we used to worry about these questions. But what's the point of being free if you can't take anybody's history and make it your own, right? But the important part is the second part, make it your own, right? It became a peculiar Indian institution. Okay? So in that sense, I don't think it's that, the Asianization of democracy is happening now. Actually, India was, I think, the pioneer in that. India sort of, broke kind of with world historical trends, in that respect. What is certainly the case now is that geopolitical power is shifting to Asia. I mean, the balance of power, you might say, after 300 years of European dominance, in material terms is certainly being restored, right? Both with the rise of China in particular, but also the rise of the East Asians in India. And that geopolitical configuration will, of course, produce new political demands, new political imaginations, right? But I would actually argue that the Asianization of democracy was already underway in 1950s. It's not a new phenomenon.
Okay, great. Professor, because you have studied and taught at an Ivy League, Ashoka is often referred to as the Ivy League of India, or more colloquially, as I've recently found out, the Harvard of Haryana. Is this a befitting juxtaposition to make, or do you think we should steer clear of trying to fit into these pre-existing molds altogether, as Ashoka is trying to carve its own unique niche in, say, the university pedagogy of the country?
So I'll give you an honest answer to this. I mean, I think there's some validity to this description as a shorthand, because particularly as a young university, and I think in a country like India, these shorthand phrases have sent signals, right? Presumably, I hope what people mean when they say Ivy League is they mean academic and intellectual quality. They don't mean football teams or, sort of legacy students or something like that, right? And certainly a lot of the basic structure, the initial idea of the 4-year degree, a lot of the faculty that Ashoka drew on, particularly in its initial years, now it has changed a lot, were from these universities. And I think Ashoka had more faculty from, the world's top 10 universities, I think, proportionately than any other Indian university. So I think it was natural for people to think, right, that this is a kind of Ivy League. But my own view is that, look, as Ashoka grows, and it is already beginning to happen, albeit in small ways, Ashoka will have an identity of its own. I think the challenge Ashoka is facing, both in terms of its curriculum and in terms of is what does it mean to be located as a top-class university in India? I mean, if we are just a pale version of Princeton, or maybe even a not so pale version of, Princeton or Harvard or whatever, right? Honest truth is that will be an achievement, but in the long run, it won't be hugely exciting. Because what that means is that you are not leveraging your context, right? You are in effect providing education to people who could have got it by gone abroad. You just happen to do it in India. Yeah? Having said that, I don't think it's an easy question to answer. What does India's location mean? And I think one of the challenges for a university like Ashoka, which is, look, let's face it, it is an elite university at the moment, right? Is what will it mean for our students to operate in an Indian context? So in a professional sense, I can tell you that story, right? Many of you will go to great professions. Many of you will go to graduate programs. Many of you will find spectacular jobs. But in a country like India, the power of the university is not going to be only how does it situate people in the elite. The power of the university is going to be how does it engage with the vernacular community around it, right? There's a language issue. It's a question under a lot of discussion at Ashoka. How do we inject the teaching of Indian languages in the curriculum, Indian materials in the curriculum? And the great advantage, I think, of being in India is that, as Jawaharlal Nehru said, look, India is this palimpsest on which every civilization has, in a sense, written its history, right? We are an enlightenment power. We are also an Asian power. We are a young country. We are an old civilization. We are an Islamic, Hindu, Christian. We are every civilization. Can the university actually reflect the full truth of that? Or does the university just become, America Light or something? I think it's a work in progress, but I think Ashoka will get there.
Absolutely. Professor, perhaps you could also at this point regale us with some tales from your time outside, given that you have taught and studied almost your entire life out of the country. So perhaps you can tell us some interesting anecdotes from your time there.
Oh God, anecdotes. One, I was lucky. I must confess, I felt very welcome at both places. I studied Oxford and Princeton, and at Harvard as a junior faculty. I know a lot of people feel scarred by their Harvard experiences. I'm not sure what a good anecdote. So just here's a couple of ones. I think, one is my first 3 or 4 weeks at Oxford when I arrived as an undergraduate, fresh from high school in India. CBSE board, had never done philosophy before, had no idea what philosophical logic was. These very fierce philosophy tutors. And Oxford had the tutorial system, right? So you can't doze off in class sitting at the back, or you can't turn the screen off. It's 2 people with a tutor, So this very dour Oxford tutor, I'll not mention his name now, but we walk into his office. This is the first day of class. And he says, sit down. And he starts talking about the course we were going to do, I think, 17th and 18th century philosophy, British empiricists. And he began by saying, he said, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. The purpose of your education is to seek the truth. It is not to be interesting. Right? So that was like, okay. He was very clear, and he taught in a way in which it was made it very clear that there is truth and then there's interesting stuff. But he was a wonderful tutor. I have to say, I think in retrospect, he learned. So a lot of the kind of I think the anecdotes were in some senses in this vein. I think very early on, an exposure to the non-instrumentality of learning, right? I think one senior scholar once saying that it was their ambition to write a book only two people in the world would read. And the point of that scholar saying that was not that he would write an obscure book. In fact, the scholar was a particularly successful, he also written best-selling books. But the idea that the purpose of scholarship, right, is in a sense not driven by instrumental or fashionable reasons. I'm just stunned looking back at how many people I encountered who were actually like that. I mean, I also encountered the ambitious sort of, those kinds of people. But I think that was a pretty overwhelming impression. I think that the early days of my undergraduate life left.
That's great. Thank you, Professor. You've also been teaching the undergraduate class of Ashoka for quite some while, and recently just started teaching the Young India Fellows. For all the aspirants who have joined this call, and for luminous like me who unfortunately missed out on the privilege of being taught by you, could you tell us a bit about the course, your YIF course in brief, and why did it take you so long to teach the YIFs?
Okay, so as I said, it's kind of hard to. So one, I mean, the short answer to the second question was actually just being a vice chancellor. I was not teaching all that much. I mean, my teaching load was half. I mean, technically, I could probably not have taught if I also wanted. And the political science department was very short-staffed. This year-long sequence in political theory is almost a kind of necessary course if you're going to be a political science major. We didn't have enough colleagues teaching it, so there was just more need there. I mean, there was just a sense that because of the structure of the YIF, you could get visitors, you could get people to substitute for you. So partly that was just a call. I must confess, though, that I think historically and otherwise as well, I love undergraduate teaching. I like graduate teaching as well. And, out of my graduate teaching, lifelong friends have come from those classes. But I have to say that graduate students have almost never surprised me. Partly, I think, because they're older. Partly because they're older, they're also more professionalized in a certain way. Undergraduates, a smart 17-year-old or 18-year-old can actually throw you the googly that actually gets you think in a very different way. And precisely because they have the courage to ask the questions that once you're 20, you look back and say, did I actually ask that question when I was 17 years old? I mean, I think when we look back on ourselves, we think like that, right? So I think that's been the kind of interest in undergraduate education as well. Larger classes. Coming to the course, I'm teaching in this shorter term. It's a course on justice. Unfortunately, it's a short course, so you don't have enough time to dig as deep as you'd like. But broadly, the course is trying to answer the question, what is justice? And it answers it largely through the debate and reading around what I think is still one of the best books on justice, John Rawls's Theory of Justice. As I said, I don't think it's a Western book at all, although it can be accused of being that. In fact, one of the things we do discuss a lot is how so many of the questions that it is asking arise organically from our context. But the class is a reflection of my interest in normative theory, which is, where do the norms by which we live as a society, what justifies them? what are the canons of justification that are applicable to them. And that's what we do with justice. Now, there's some applied topics as well. So this year, for example, the very provocative question we discussed, which is, can you justify a meritocracy at all? Or another big policy question from the point of view of justice, should a society guarantee a minimum basic income to all its citizens unconditionally, right? Those kinds of questions about justice.
That's great. Hopefully, at some point in the future, if maybe this stays online, some of us earlier alumnus can also tune in and listen to one of those great classes. Professor, my last question to you before we start addressing the audience questions would be that our generation is perpetually battling political anxiety, right? Because of the kind of things that are going on around us. How do you maintain work-life balance and switch off? Or is it even possible to do that given that all politics is personal and has a way of seeping in everywhere? And on that note, if you have any little nuggets of wisdom or advice you give to students like who've tuned in or anything about this or anything else in particular?
Wow, what a question. I'd love to hear how you all cope with it, actually. I mean, I think, as I said, we are old enough to, escape. I mean, we can console ourselves by saying, look, our innings is past. You guys will have to live your lives through this stuff. I think two things about this. I mean, I think one, let's first of all admit the fact that we are in very unusual political times, right? What I said in my opening remarks, that I could take certain contours of the world for granted, which I can't. And so it's forcing you to think in very fundamental existential ways in which, you probably didn't have to, right? The second, of course, feature characteristic of politics is the fact that it is extraordinarily polarized. I mean, I'll be very honest with you. I think the divisions in politics now run through our social relations. They sometimes cut through our families. Certainly, having lived in Delhi for the last 20 years, or NCR, Gurgaon, Delhi for the last 20 years, I've never seen an atmosphere where people are losing so many friends over politics. I mean, you could always say that politics was a sphere and then you had your friends. Yeah. So I think the anxieties that I think you are experiencing are very real for all of us. I would just say two things, and particularly because of where you are as YIF alumni and YIF, and what we hope Ashoka can do at some point, is that, a course like the YIF or an undergraduate program or being at a university, you are in an ivory tower, and that's a good thing. I mean, I would defend the university as an ivory tower any day. That is its function. And its function is to give you a little bit of distance, right? When you're actually doing politics, you're playing for winning and losing, right? We all get worked up in politics so much when we think about it because we want to know our side winning, our side losing, right? In the ivory tower, you can get distance from that partisan battle. Okay? Don't get distance from your own values. Obviously, you can't engage seriously with politics if you're not clear about your own values are. Okay? But can you think of ways in which we don't, in our discussions internally with each other, right, intellectually, reproduce the same distinctions and the same pathologies that the larger politics is doing, right? Our conception of friend and enemy is organized exactly in the same way, right? And so one thing is to use the YF to actually get distance from politics. Take a longer range historical view. Ask the question, do we have to keep reproducing the same debate over and over again? What is the kernel of truth in both sides? And because you're not involved in that partisan battle, you have the luxury to do it, right? Which somebody in actual politics can't. Let's be very clear. Their aim is to win. Okay? So I think that's I think one thing. The second thing is just in terms of keep saying, which is don't lose your interest in life. I mean, I have to say, all throughout my life, both as an undergraduate and all that, unless I listen to certain number of hours, minutes of music a day, I just feel the day is not, I'll lose my sanity. But the minute you listen to it, you're restored to a certain kind of equilibrium, right? Um, it's that ultimate expression of both something that is, incredibly beautiful, incandescent, but also non-instrumental. It just takes you away from the world of power like that. So think of, what is it that is the equivalent for you? For some people, it can be just losing themselves in a novel. Keep that part of your life, seriously alive.
Professor, on that note, I know I said it was the last question, but now I think, including me, a lot of people would be curious. What music do you listen to? What is this music that restores your peace?
I fairly eclectic. I mean, I can listen to all kinds. I mean, I can I can do Bollywood film songs of any generation, any variety. But the longer term sustaining is Indian classical, particularly vocal. I mean, that's the stuff that really gets you kind of, out of your, element in some ways. That requires more time. But that's exactly the point. In fact, one of the things I often say to students, talking of anecdotes from philosophy classes, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, used to say that philosophers should greet each other with the greeting slow down. That's our function, right? Slow down. Let's make a few more distinctions. Not so fast. You can't come to this conclusion, right? And I think at this point, I think elements that make you slow down in the deepest sense of the term. Slow doesn't mean you're not productive. In fact, I think there's a conflation between speed and productivity in our civilization that is quite destructive. Things that slow you down a bit.
Absolutely. There is a very interesting question about, say, this idea of this disinformation age that we're living in, which is augmented even more by the amount of social media we use for getting news, for saying things, for having opinions, etc. So how do you think the idea of dissent is changing in today's democracy with this entire social media that has come about?
So I think a couple of things. So one, I think just as a historical matter, I think we have to be a little careful. We do say that social media has transformed the nature of public discourse. There's no question about it, right? And I mean, my own view is that sometimes we underestimate. Maybe we are an age that Europe was in when printing was first discovered, right? I mean, one of the things we forget about the printing revolution, it completely transformed society in more ways that you can imagine. It democratized the information order, but it also produced lots of conflictual upheavals. I mean, the Protestant Revolution, for example, right? The crumbling of authority that we say the age of social media has produced. Very much associated with the first printer. So maybe we are in a very tectonic shift in the creation of an information order whose contours we don't fully understand yet. Okay. But having said that, so we should not exaggerate that this is unique to us. It's happened in the past. By the way, political polarization has also happened in the past. I mean, we managed to produce a fair lot of communalization of Indian politics in the 1930s and 40s without social media, right? So there's no unique connection between social media and polarization, but I think a couple of things to think about. One, which to my mind, I think is quite important, is that, a liberal society has always depended on a distinction between the public and the private, right? In part, it needs this distinction, not because the private is immune from questioning, but because has to be the space on which you exercise sovereignty, which is your space in some ways, right? Okay, where you discover your own selves, where you can actually sometimes even think evil thoughts, right? I mean, let's face it, that's part of what it actually, in a sense, means to grow. What social media has done in the way we, I think, engage with it, the rules and protocols, it has completely collapsed that distinction. So what you could use as maybe banter with a bunch of friends The minute you put it on social media, it becomes your permanent identity. That's what the world knows you for, right? That one tweet that you made in half jest, half haste, half, right? And we still haven't got used to the idea that, unlike, let's say, private conversations, right? You go out for, coffee with your friends, you say all kinds of things, and, you come back. Social media is paradoxically actually marks us much more permanently than we think. The second thing it does is that once you have made that public, that then also becomes your identity. You don't want to climb down, right? Okay. So one thing to think about is, what are your own protocols for engaging with social media? And I can tell you mine, which is I don't. I just post an article, that's it. I don't reply. I do read a lot of social media. There's no, I won't, I mean, that's right. Precisely for, in a sense, this reason that, you should put out only what, in a sense, you're 100%, clear of standing by. So I think that's one thing. What is our own ethics of engaging with it? I think the second thing to think about is, what are the deep drivers of this misinformation? Is it just a few bad people wanting to lie to us? Or is there a systematic incentive in the business models of social media, right, that privilege certain kinds of information? And I think we haven't asked that question deeply enough, which is, so long as, the business model remains one of through advertising, is it going to be the case that there is an investment in raising the temperature, right? As my old tutor would have said, it pays to be interesting. It doesn't pay to seek the truth, right? So you have to do a lot more analytical work about the business models and the foundations of social media, rather than a kind of moralistic response. So-and-so is bad, so-and-so is this. And last and finally, I mean, this is one of the cruel things about truth and doubt, right? Which is, there's an asymmetry, which is that if you want to cast doubt on something, all you have to do is create doubt, right? Truth has a higher standard to beat if it wants to be established in truth. And that's the asymmetry that social media exploits very powerfully, right? 5 people have said it, must be enough to ask a question. But doubt can be more corrosive, actually, for your sense of self than truth is.
Absolutely, Professor. We're living in an age, unfortunately, where we cannot escape our past, no matter how much we try to, because it's all out there for everyone to see. Professor, there are a lot of questions on very existential note, I would say, that are about what do you think is the future of Indian democracy, which are more along the lines of, do you think the constitution needs to be updated, replaced, or do you think that there are ways we can learn from the past mistakes and maybe like somehow apply those to the present context?
Okay, wow, this is a big question, and I wish I had the answers to this. As I said, our generation did a terrible job of this. I think, let me put it this way. If you are looking for an alternative to the current political conjunction, and I don't mean just the BJP, I mean, it's not like in its current state, the Congress provides a viable alternative. In fact, to be fair, you have to say the old system collapsed of its own weight. It had just got too oligarchic. It had got too undemocratic in its own different way. Right? You need to learn a couple of things from the BJP. Okay, so this might surprise many of you. Why am I saying, well, what do we need to learn from the BJP? The BJP has internalized a couple of basic truths about politics that I think non-BJP parties and those who are looking for alternative, better visions have ignored for the most part. So the first truth is political reality is always made and constructed. It is never pre-given, right? One of the problems with left parties in India and centrist parties in India is that we all became socially deterministic, right? We just said, look, people have these identities, they will vote these identities, let's do the mathematics of it, let's see how do you get to 31% of the vote, and boom, right? Our problems are solved. BJP grasped the fact that identities are constructed through ideas, through discursive techniques, through actual hard work of mobilization, right? You can change identities, you can unsettle them, you can, break down older identities, reconstruct them into this phenomenon called Hindutva. In short, they did politics while the rest of us were doing social science. Okay, so that's lesson number one. You have to, the short answer to what kind of politics you have is what kind of politics are you willing to create? There is no such thing as a pre-given politics. There's no such thing as a, right? I think the second thing they did, which is something that the Congress had done in the 1920s, 1930s under Gandhi in a very different way, is apart from the imperatives of electoral politics, which are important, who's going to win tomorrow, can the Congress revive, all those kinds of things. The BJP's greatest asset is organizations that are playing for the long-term transformation of India, whether you agree with them or not. I think the RSS is a perfect example of it, right? It'll also celebrate its 100th anniversary in, I think, a couple of years, okay? Just as a matter of organizational theory, right? India is a country where we say institutions don't last, right? How come this organization has lasted 100 years, right? How is it able to do this long-term work of cultural transformation? I happen to not like the direction in which they want to transform Indian society and culture. I happen to think it's dangerous and in parts evil and will, is a threat to human dignity and democracy. But I have to give it to them, right? They have been, in a sense, doing that hard work, right? And you see it in elections, you see it off elections. What is the equivalent in an alternative side and scenario, right? Other than using social media and then praying to God that, some opposition party wins an election here and there, right? So the kind of movement that Gandhi and Nehru did, right, from the 1920s to 1940s, saying, look, there's a political track, but there is this track of mobilization outside politics. That's something I think our generation, your generation will have to learn all over again. We just got too complacent. We thought, this settled framework exists. The state is an instrument for social transformation. Bingo, right? Prime Minister Modi is right. That takes hard work, not Harvard. Okay, so you'll have to, in a sense, give up the credentialism part and think of what an alternative politics would look like if done with this kind of organizational strength.
Absolutely. Professor, there are a couple of questions about the backsliding of democracy that's happening globally, not just in India. We can see that a lot of places, populist leaders, populist movement are gaining more momentum as you and I are talking right now. What do you think is driving this sudden inherent hate and bigotry, let's put it that way, and like this entire populist backsliding that's happening all across the world? Why is this suddenly happening, and what's the incentive? What's driving people to do and delve into these kinds of movements?
No, this is a very good question. So look, I mean, obviously there are individual country variations, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, India, United States were slightly different. Each have their own histories. But, there are 3 or 4 common themes that I think clearly are emerging, kind of the deeper roots of this crisis. The first, I would argue, actually, is to give it a summary name, the 2009 financial crisis. Why is the 2009 financial crisis significant? I mean, some of these populist movements predate 2009 financial, but why is it Why am I using it as a placeholder, a marker, right? One, the 2009 financial crisis, in some senses, exposed the old ruling regimes of almost all of these countries, right, including India's, by the way, as in some deep senses implicated in corruption. Okay, I don't mean just overt corruption of, are you taking bribes, but the sense that the system was being rigged very, very seriously, right, to privilege particular elites. Now, people were willing to put up with it so long as the economic game was going nicely, chugging along well enough, right? It's not an accident in India, as growth plummets post 2009 crisis. Then this whole question of policy paralysis, corruption, plutocracy, and in some senses paralysis, right, became the two watchwords in Indian politics, right? That's the anti-corruption movement in our. By the way, plutocracy became a watchword in any of these projects. Any new party said, the one thing we are going to do is destroy that old plutocracy. Now, the fact that they created a new one is a different matter, but that's in a sense one dimension to it, right? I think the second dimension has to do, this is with us, right? People like the YIFs, Ashoka, and so forth, is, the conventional institutions that were the instruments of social mobility, education, for example, right? The one most important one, right? We used to say education, education, education. India, of course, failed at it, but if you provide more education, you can create new avenues of social mobility. Increasingly, people are beginning to feel that education is the site of reproducing inequalities. Yes, I mean, everybody's boats are being lifted, but it's not that structure of inequality is actually being displaced. Okay? So, and it's not an accident that one thing common in all these populist movements is a serious backlash and revolt against the idea of intellectuals and technocracy. Because these were seen as credentialed ways of reproducing social inequality, not as a kind of antidote to it. So Mr. Orban rails against intellectuals, Trump rails against intellectuals, Mr. Modi rails against everybody, right? But see the sociological resonance of it. You can laugh when Mr. Modi said, hard work, not Harvard. But he was actually expressing a truth. That Harvard is a credentialized system that I think now reproduces privilege. It has no connection with what I'm going to do with you, right? That's I think, a second, kind of common strand. The third strand has to do, in a sense, with the backlash against globalization. Where now, I think there the Indian story is actually more complicated. I think at one level you can argue in India's case, right, which is the resurgence of nationalism, that when I look at Indian debates now, it reminds me a lot of the 1920s and 1930s. And that's what fills me with dread, in a sense, a little bit, right? That we still don't seem to have resolved. I mean, all the stuff, love jihad, to conversion, to cow protection, to prejudice against religious communities. I mean, you could be rereading a novel from the 1930s, right? So we have our own particular local history that feeds into, as it were, this. But one of the things that every political society, questions that every political society has to answer, which I think liberals don't have a very easy answer to, is what is it that gives that society the distinctive identity that it has? Saying that we have a liberal constitution is an argument about justice. It's not an argument about your distinctive identity, right? It's not an argument about who is member of your society. Liberalism historically has not had a theory of membership. It has had a theory of justice. It has a theory of rights. It doesn't have a theory of membership. And with globalization, with migration, immigration, as countries integrate into the global economy, questions of membership become important again. In the United States and Europe, it was around immigration and foreigners, which is a question of membership, right? And frankly, it's also a question where the liberals are the most vulnerable. No liberal is for completely open borders. And so then the question becomes, okay, on what ground can we exclude? In India, right? In part, the debate is also over membership. Who is a member of this political community, right? And of course, that became a convenient electoral mobilizing wedge by which you can actually create a majoritarian identity. But some of these strands are actually pretty common to countries across the world.
Professor, there's a very interesting question about the idea of justice that I think is very relevant. A bunch of people have asked about the biases and the beliefs that come when you're acting as a dispenser or a harbinger of justice in any role, especially in the case of India, where we can see that slowly the judiciary is encroaching, or the idea of judicial barbarism is coming up. So how do we approach justice as a system then when it's being influenced by so many biases, by so much just self-interest creeping in when it's supposed to not be that way?
So, I mean, there's lots of questions packed into that. So let me just briefly address two, I think. One is a kind of narrower question, which is, I think, the disappointment a lot of people have with the Indian judiciary at this moment. And I must confess to being one of those. In fact, I think the abdication of the judiciary of its role has been one of the kind of scandals of the last 5 to 7 years. And it's all the more scandal because you might say ostensibly there's no reason for it, right? This is the most protected branch of government. Judges have all the protection that they need. I mean, what's the worst that can happen to a Supreme Court judge, right? Even if they don't get post-retirement perk from government, they can do arbitration. I mean, it's seriously, with that much security, that much prestige, that much independence of the institution, if you can't do your job, nobody's asking you to be heroic, right? Right now, when a judge gives a half-decent bail order, we say, oh, hallelujah, right? Okay. Now, what's going on in those kinds of situations? That's the narrower question. Is it that these biases are coming in because there are true committed ideological believers in the judiciary, which happens sometimes, right? That you have the elites of a country, particularly ones that control these kinds of institutions, right? Who see in certain forms of nationalism a kind of reassertion of their own identities, okay? Are unwilling to take on government. I hope it's not that, but if it is that, then India is in deep trouble, right? In some way. So is that the source of bias? Or is it just more quotidian, just lack of courage, right? That somehow you've ended up with a bunch of judges, and maybe that's the old regime's fault because of it's the kind of selection process that it is, who are extraordinarily insecure, who don't have the intellectual confidence in some senses to be actually articulate the very constitution and law on which they're premised. And it's also, I think, a salutary reminder that security and credentialism doesn't give you the character to fight for liberty necessarily. My worry about India is that the elites are the group that is actually caving in the fastest, right? And if you're cynical about it, you can say that's partly because they want to use Hindutva as a way of legitimizing and shoring up their own power, right? That's the narrower question. The larger question about bias and justice is, in a sense, the promise of our social contract, right? Which is every society will have economic and social contradictions. Can you make the basic structure of society work enough such that the least well off, Gandhi's wiping the tear in every last eye, right? What is it about the nature of politics that we actually have consistently failed on that, right? And that, to be fair, is not a failing of this government. I mean, there have been better periods, worse periods, but I think India has remarkable achievements since independence. But our effectiveness in providing the minimum material basis for social self-respect for most people has actually been pretty awful. I mean, malnutrition, we just have to look at the figures. Have to look at our investments in health and education. Um, is it that the privileged, right, are so protecting their competitive space? That's the deeper kind of bias, right? That we are all, in a sense, conspiring to make sure that the promise of justice in our constitution is not fulfilled. That bias will take the work of politics. I mean, that's not something that can be, in a sense, corrected either by the right ideas or simply by creating new and more independent institutions.
Let's hope that we embark on a better political journey. On a concluding note, Professor, do you have any advice for potential YF applicants this year in the nature of the YF, or what would you advise them during their application?
Faculty are the last people you should ask about application process. I think Ania and the YIF team could probably, in some senses, I think, better, I think
Yeah,
answer
but
that. But
more on the nature of the YF itself.
yeah, no, as I said, I think, look, the excitement of the YF is that it's a very diverse cohort. People come for the diversity of reasons. And I think one of the good things about the YF is that it allows a lot of those interests to flourish. Some of you are going to be making the transition from engineering to humanities. Some of you are coming because you want to actually deepen your knowledge. Some of you are actually coming because you want to slow down, take a distance from your work life, and see if there's a space for a kind of larger, more detached reflection on the nature of society. The great thing about YF is that it can actually accommodate all of these different aspirations quite successfully. So I think rather than second guessing the program, try and be clear about what your motivation, what would you like to get out of YF. And if you can project and articulate that well, you'll be able to make full use of it.
Absolutely. I think on that note, we can conclude. I say this for everyone who joined us that this was a perfect balance of a critical, thought provoking endeavor and an informal conversation. And those balances are really hard to find. Thank you so much for your valuable time, Professor. We really, really hope to see you again. And thank you, everyone, for joining in and the YF team for organizing this.
Thank you so much, Aanchal, for your wonderful questions, and thanks to everybody. And hope we'll see some of you next year. Those of who are aspiring to be at Ashoka. Look forward to seeing you in person.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. See you.
I see it.